Welcome to Moments with Marianne. This is your host, Marianne Pastana. We're here today with special guest, Donna Simmons, who's here to share with us Ending Child Marriage, a Survivor's Mission for Change. So why does child marriage still exist in nearly every U.S. state? And what can we do to stop it? Well, today's guest is here to share with us just that. Donna Simmons is a wife, mother, author, and dedicated advocate for breaking cycles of generational trauma and supporting mental health recovery. Appointed by the governor to the Kentucky Juvenile Justice Advisory Board, she collaborates with leaders across the state to reduce juvenile system involvement and strengthen protective factors for at-risk youth. A survivor of child abuse and exploitation, Donna's personal journey fuels her mission to help others transform pain into purpose. Her memoir, Ashes to Flame, chronicles her experience of survival and healing, encouraging others to uncover their own inner resilience. Donna's story has been featured in Good Housekeeping, Glamour, NPR, PBS, and Fox News, among many others. She is a frequent speaker, trainer, and panelist at both national and international conferences, and she has testified before legislative committees advocating for systemic change. So welcome to the show, Donna Simmons.
Thank you so much, Marianne. It's an honor to be with you again.
Well, what an honor it is to have you here and to not only share your story, but just how we can get involved because it's such a topic I think people need to be very aware of. Can you share a little bit about your story with us?
Absolutely. So I grew up in a very abusive household, unfortunately. And part of that was because of my mother's own trauma. My mother was married off at 13 years of age to my dad, who at that time was already a grown man who had two sons from his first marriage. He had already served in the Korean War at that time as well. So when he married my mother at 13, she only had an eighth grade education. And having to have had the responsibility to become a mother now to two small boys, ages 5 and 3 at the time, she didn't have the ability to continue that education or really develop, any type of skills that could have made her a sovereign individual. My dad was abusive towards her. She had certainly experienced her own early trauma as well. And between that, the limited capacity that she had intellectually because of her stunted educational opportunities, and all of the trauma that she experienced that she did not have the chance to heal from, she ended up later on in life when I was born, she ended up normalizing her situation and passing that torch on to me. And so, because of all of the pain she had endured, she ended up abusing me physically and emotionally. She had a horrific response when I disclosed childhood sexual abuse that I had experienced at 5 years of age. And when I disclosed that, she had a very damaging response. And with all of this internalization of all of this abuse and, really seeing all of this as my fault as a child, as children tend to do, I ended up growing up with just a horrible self-esteem and self-image. And then my father was diagnosed with advanced stage lung cancer when I was 13. And when he passed shortly after that diagnosis, I just broke down and nothing else mattered. I didn't have any sense of who I was. I didn't have, any sense of a future for myself. And so I ended up acting out. My mother, as I mentioned, had been very physically abusive. And when she would go to beat me after my father had passed away, I started standing up for myself. I was so angry. I was so filled with so much grief and so much anger. And so that ended up resulting in me being admitted to a behavioral health facility when I was 14 years old. And that facility was Charter Behavioral Health. And the one that I was at was located in Jeffersonville, Indiana. Now, instead of receiving the help that I needed at that time, I was groomed by a 29-year-old mental health technician that worked at that facility. And he ended up, convincing me that I was so much more mature than a 14-year-old and, that I was, intellectually his equal and that we were soulmates and, all of these things that really inflated myself or my, sense of self-worth for the first time. And so through that, I ended up becoming extremely attached to him, not aware at the time, as children would not be, that this was grooming by a predator. And when I was released from that facility, again, my mother, having normalized this large disparity in age and child marriage based on her own early life experience, she consented to me dating him for 2 years. So he would either come down to London, Kentucky, where I was living at the time after I was released from that facility, and, he would spend the night. My mother allowed that. Or my mother would drive me up to Elizabethtown, Kentucky, which he would drive down from where he lived in Jeffersonville, Indiana, and meet us halfway. My mother would drop me off at a motel. The staff at the motel didn't question how this 14-year-old girl and 29-year-old man were renting a motel room for a few hours, despite the fact that it occurred on many instances. And there was so much problematic nature with the fact that there were not adults standing up and questioning what was wrong with that situation that it continued for 2 years before my mother ended up consenting to me marrying him when I was 16. And as a result of that marriage, I didn't even complete the 10th grade. And when we got married, I began working full time for minimum wage, which back at that time was $6.25 an hour. Who I now refer to as my perpetrator, was not working. He had quit work. And so I was the sole provider at 16 years of age when he was 31. He was extremely abusive, extremely coercive and manipulative. And when I tried to leave to go to a domestic violence shelter, I could not seek refuge there because I was not yet considered an adult. And it's such a hypocritical law, the fact that we can allow legally for predators to hide their offenses behind a marriage license. And yet, children do not have the legal ability to escape those abusive situations because of the fact that they haven't reached adulthood. We place children in situations of danger without regard to the fact that they are going to be stuck legally in these situations, as I was. And, as time went on, so much of the abuse that I suffered from him became very brainwashing. And again, that lack of self esteem that I had developed as a child. And then, to have him lift me up and elevate me for a short period of time just to bring me crashing back down even further than what I had been previously was devastating to me. And when I was 17 years old, I became pregnant. I was just to, show how very pregnant I was on my 18th birthday. My birthday is at the end of January, and my oldest daughter's birthday is at the beginning of March. And for my 18th birthday, I was taken to a strip club by my perpetrator for his own gratification. Again, heavily pregnant and just completely mortified. But if I argued against what he wished for, sticking up for myself and honoring myself, then I was abused even more. And so what I realized later was that he was using that experience to desensitize me to the world of commercial sexual exploitation. Because shortly after my daughter was born, he made me begin working there. That completely diminished my credibility, and I'm sure that was part of his intention. And so when eventually I was able to start saving up and getting out of that situation, the judge looked at, our petition to dissolve the marriage and saw that, he was in his 30s. He was a college graduate. At that time, he had begun working again, so he had a sustainable income. For me, I was a high school dropout and I was making at that time $8 an hour, working like 20 hours a week. I did not have a, sovereign ability. I was a mess emotionally. These were all things that he had done. And of course, he also disclosed that I had been working in a strip club, but of course, not that he is the one that put me there. And so when the judge made a custody decision for my oldest daughter, he granted my perpetrator custody of her. And what I didn't find out until years later was that I was ordered to pay child support to this offender. And so again, all of these extremely seemingly insurmountable obstacles came my way. And so I had tried to maintain a relationship with my oldest daughter. I would try to visit her. He would put up barriers to that. I did not feel that I had any legal recourse. I wasn't taken seriously during the divorce proceedings. And, I didn't really have the ability to advocate for myself. And so ultimately, my oldest daughter ended up being the ultimate victim in this situation because she had to grow up feeling as though her mother had abandoned her when that was not the case. I want to bring this full circle because if you look at my mother's history, this 13-year-old girl that was married off, she didn't have a chance. And that does not excuse the behavior and the abuse and the way that she handled other forms of abuse towards me. But it does portray the fact that generational cycles of trauma perpetuate these cycles within family units. And when she passed her own history with pain onto me, what ended up happening was that my own painful history was passed to my oldest daughter. Now, I will say that because I was able to eventually break free from that situation, and start developing my own sense of self, my own identity. I started working full time at an organization where there was promotional opportunity. I was able to get my GED. I was able to get a college degree. I graduated with my degree in business administration, summa cum laude. These were huge accomplishments that started building my self-esteem and my sense of worth and my sense of what I had to contribute to the community. And so when my oldest daughter was 11, she actually came to live with me for a few years. So we were able to start building some sense of relationship at that time. And it certainly was not perfect, but it was able to foster a seed forward. And that to me, that small seed in changing the path is what starts to unravel those cycles of generational trauma. And that is the hope that we need. But we have to start off with common sense legislation that puts an end to the legality of this type of abuse.
It's unreal to me that child marriages are taking place in the US. I mean, children don't they mentally don't develop until later, and obviously this guy was completely manipulating you in
Right,
order for you to be in a place where you would marry him. And
right,
the thing that also floors me, we talked about this last time as well, is once you marry your perpetrator, like, you have no protections.
right. Exactly. Yes, once a child marries, they do not have the same access to child protective services that they would had the marriage not occurred. There are so many statistics around this as well. And, one of the things that I think is so incredibly devastating is that, when you look at just the national statistic in general, girls and young women ages 16 to 24 experience the highest rates of intimate partner violence. And girls ages 16 to 19 years of age experience intimate partner violence victimization rates that almost triple what the national average is. And so if you look at that and then you consider child marriage itself, as I had mentioned, I tried to go to a domestic violence shelter and I was turned away. And I was turned away because, as the lady at the shelter told me, they could not accept the legal obligation to care for me. I would have been a liability to them. A domestic violence shelter. It's completely hypocritical. The other thing to keep in mind too is that if a minor is trying to avoid a forced marriage or trying to escape an abusive marriage, they may not be able to leave home without being taken into custody themselves and then returned by the police. And again, they may not be able to stay in a domestic violence shelter at all or even in a youth shelter for longer than a few days. And one of the most devastating and backwards pieces of law around this is that friends or allies of that child that is trying to escape this situation who offer to take them in and give them a safe space, they risk being charged with contributing to the delinquency of a minor or even harboring a runaway. If the minor attempts to obtain a home of their own, they may not find anybody willing to rent to them because legally they cannot enter into a contract. And that was another part of my own experience. I was turned away by two different apartment complexes because I could not legally enter into a contract despite the fact that I was working full time and able to evidence that I could afford them on my own.
That's just unreal. But it makes sense because we can't get into contracts with minors. I mean,
Right.
that's just is something we can't do because they're not legally responsible for themselves.
Yes, that's exactly true. And, again, when you look at the fact that, and again, going back to my own situation, I couldn't even sign the marriage license for myself. My mother had to sign my name on it because I was not yet of age. So I could not legally consent to be in this marriage. My mother had to do that for me. And then, when I was supposedly an emancipated adult because of the marriage, I still didn't have legal protections or legal accessibilities that were meaningful to be an adult. Again, it's a completely hypocritical situation from that legal standpoint.
Did he quit his job because he didn't want his coworkers knowing he married a minor?
That is a very great question. And yes, actually, so here's the irony too of charter behavioral health. I was there in 1998 when I was 14 years old. CNN actually did a really big expose on charter behavioral health, and I believe it aired in early 1999 when they filed bankruptcy. So, charter behavioral health, the year after I was released, ended up no longer existing, or at least the one that I was in Jeffersonville, Indiana. So he ended up getting a different job at a different mental health facility where he was actually going out into the field and picking up minors for visitations with their parents. So he had access to these kids. Well, when he married me and I was 16, he went to add me to his insurance that he had at this place that he was working at the time. And of course, my birthday, being in 1984, arose some suspicion. So he bowed out very quickly because he did not want things questioned about how he ended up marrying a 16-year-old girl. He also had his own dependency issues, which were hidden from me prior to the marriage. So there were times when I would come home from the grocery store that I was working at full time, and, he would be passed out on the couch or in the bathtub, having drank an entire bottle or half a bottle or what have you of some type of liquor. And he also used other substances. So I basically went from, being in a situation where my mother did not care for me and I had to become her caregiver in a lot of ways emotionally. And also I had to take care of my father as he was dying because my mother just abandoned me in that situation as well. I go from that to now having to take care of this grown man who is supposed to be my husband. It was a debilitating time in my life.
And here you're still a child through all of this.
Yes, still very much a child, still with a lot of emotional immaturity, to be very honest, because of the abuse that I had endured. And also, a repeat of my mother's situation, had my own educational opportunities stunted.
So, what are some ways? Because I'm sure people are going, okay, is my state a state that allows child marriages? And if so, how can I get involved to stop this?
Yes. So, considering the fact that there are only 13 states in the US that require the age of majority, age 18 and up, to be able to enter into a marriage, chances are you live in a state that does allow children to marry. On my website, traumatopurpose.com, we have information around state by state, what the current statuses are. We list out the states that do provide that most protective factor of being the age of majority and up. And in addition to that, I'm actually working on completing some advocacy packets for folks in different states to be able to leverage when communicating with their own legislators. Unfortunately, it is a state by state initiative, and we have a lot of people that have this misconception that, these are situations where it's primarily two 17-year-olds or two 16-year-olds that are marrying. When we look at the data, that is not the case. The majority of these are between a minor and a person much older than them. And so that's obviously a power imbalance. That information needs to be provided by legislators, state by state. We also need additional survivors to come forward and to elevate their voices in a safe manner that feels okay to them to share. We certainly don't want anybody to, feel overly exposed or re-traumatized by sharing their experience. But survivor voices are so important in the fight to end child marriage. And survivors can get in contact with me through my website, traumatopurpose.com, as well. There's one more piece on the legislative front that I will mention. We actually have legislation that was filed by Senator Durbin back in August 2024. It's called the Child Marriage Prevention Act, and it's under S 4990. And this act would require states to study the impact of child marriage. It does not call for an end-all be-all and a quick lift for all states to elevate the minimum age to 18, whereas it's certainly a start towards progress. And I'm very grateful for that. I do think we can do better. And I am meeting with a congressman next week to go over what my vision for a companion bill would look like that would achieve greater protections. And hopefully we can work through that expediently. One of the things that we have to consider is the intersectionality between child marriage and other harms, including poverty and psychiatric conditions and serious health conditions as well. Just a quick statistic, girls who marry in their early teens are up to 31% more likely to live in future poverty. And Women who marry as children have much higher rates of certain psychiatric disorders and a 23% greater risk of developing a serious health condition like diabetes, cancer, heart attack, or stroke. So, again, we have to look at this from that broader lens and see the ongoing harms that occur when children are placed in positions they are not ready for.
And it seems interesting when we have children coming out of situations that could be abusive. They're in a family situation, the dynamics are very abusive, the cycle there is poverty, lack of education, abuse, what have you. It sounds like they get love bombed by these predators that
Mhm.
are saying, "Hey, I can make your life so much better." And that's definitely not the case. And they still are using a child's mind to try to figure out these very adult situations.
That is absolutely true. And, another thing to keep in mind is that a lot of times these are children that are vulnerable anyway because they've had early life traumatic experiences and they don't have a good support system to be able to protect them from that type of manipulation. Just as an example, my perpetrator worked as a mental health professional in a facility where he worked on the adolescent girls unit. He had access to be manipulative and to be able to groom multiple children, including me. Now my situation went a bit further because for me, he found the perfect mix of a mother who had been through a similar path and one that would not question things. And so I became the perfect victim for him to target. And there are so many predators in our country that find those same vulnerabilities in children and exploit them for their own gratification.
It sounds like it's very difficult for children to get out of those situations once they're in them.
It is absolutely difficult for children to escape those situations, especially considering the fact that they do not have the same legal, authority over their own lives as they would if they were age 18.
What would you like readers and our listeners to take away, not just from your book, Ashes to Flame, but the work that you're doing?
It's important to me that readers understand that in order to really effectively break generational cycles of trauma, we have to stop the bleeding with common sense legislation that prevents these atrocities from being perpetuated. Predators should not be able to hide their offenses behind a marriage license. Advocating against child marriage is a huge first step in the road to recovery of generational trauma. The second piece is very much realizing that for survivors, it is not their fault. Another's crime against you is not your shame to carry. It took me 2 decades of my life to be able to unravel that narrative of myself as being to blame and to realize that the burden of responsibility always falls on the adult. But as survivors, we do have a superpower to be able to use our experiences to really humanize these harms and be able to call for change. And that's why any survivor that is looking for a sense of community around their experience and who is looking to reframe that pain into purpose, I invite you to connect with me through my website, traumatopurpose.com.
Well, Donna, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Thank you so much, Marianne. I appreciate your willingness to highlight this critical topic.
Well, thank you, Donna. It's been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about ending child marriage. Make sure to connect with Donna on her website, traumatopurpose.com. Be part of her community. Make sure to download her book, Ashes to Flame, and also learn how you can get involved in ending child marriage. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.